By the 1st century, Rome dominated the Mediterranean. For 300 years, her armies had crushed the military rabbles of other nations. Her empire stretched from Europe in the north to Egypt in the south and as far east as Syria. Roman victories had brought in a massive influx of slaves. At the time, it was thought to be barbaric to kill prisoners of war, so the army sold these people into slavery, bringing them great wealth. This massive influx of cheap labour into the marketplace greatly helped the better off. Suddenly, wealthy landowners had cheap labour to work their farms and maintain their houses. This cheap labour of slavery became one of the economic foundations of the empire. One of these wealthy landowners to benefit from slave labour was a man named Philemon. Now, Philemon lived in Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, in a town named Colossae. Colossae was a rural community only a few kilometres away from two major cities, the first being the banking capital of the region called Laodicea. And the second city was the majestic retirement city of Hierapolis. As a slave owner in the 1st century, Philemon was the all-powerful ruler of his own household. A slave owner could command his slave to carry out any duty. If a slave refused, then the owner could discipline the slave, have him beaten, whipped, or even sold at the local markets or put to death. For the most part, slaves were treated quite well by their owners, as they were the means by which income could be generated. In Philemon's household, there was one very unhappy slave. His name was Onesimus. Philemon regarded Onesimus as lazy and at times useless. If Onesimus wasn't willing to work, then Philemon needed either to discipline him or to get rid of him. Relationships between Philemon and Onesimus got a lot worse after a business trip to Ephesus. Ephesus was the major trading capital along the Aegean coast. It had a large population. The city's numbers grew as caravans crossed Asia Minor from the east and met shipping from the west. At the time, Philemon wasn't the only one drawn to Ephesus. Another man by the name of Saul was also drawn to the city. Saul came here to share the good news of a newfound faith. During the early part of the 1st century, a new religion was born. They were known as the people of the way. Many in the Roman world considered this new religion as nothing more than a Jewish cult. It was first established in Israel. The followers of this new way believed that the God of the Jews had come into the world as a person, that he'd lived for 30 or so years around the Galilee, and significantly that he died at the hands of the Romans. For them, his death was a bridge of forgiveness. It meant the possibility of new life, a new beginning with God. And the foundations for their faith was established on the most remarkable claim: that this dead man was raised to life on the 3rd day.
against the people. And this place, and further I've brought Greeks into the temple.
Now, temple officials in Jerusalem were fervently opposed to this new way and tried to put an end to it immediately. One of the people that they recruited for the job was a man named Saul. Saul was an angry young Pharisee who was intent on destroying this new way and bringing the followers in line with the temple's teaching. He hears of a group of believers in Damascus in Syria, so he approaches the temple authorities for permission to travel to Damascus and deal with these people himself. Saul's journey to Damascus changed his life forever. He left Jerusalem prepared to tear apart the followers of this new way. However, when he arrived, he became one of them and was baptized a Christian.
And as I made my journey and was come nigh unto Damascus, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me. And I could not see for the glory of that light. And I heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why persecutest thou me? And I answered, Who art thou, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom thou persecutest. And one Ananias, a devout man, came and said unto me, Brother Saul, receive thy sight. And I looked up upon him. He said, The God of our fathers hath chosen thee. Thou shalt be his witness unto all men of what thou hast seen and heard.
Saul now changed his name to Paul. Paul began several journeys travelling around Asia Minor, telling people about his newfound faith. One of these people was Philemon. Paul arrived at the synagogue in Ephesus and spoke to the gathering.
Thus, by the grace of God, will I continue all the days of my life to testify to these things, which were the promise of our prophets.
The Messiah already come, and they knew him not.
Crucified in company of thieves.
He promises us remission of sin.
Where is it written that our sins shall be forgiven us?
We have but to believe.
For some people who heard him, this made sense. For others, it enraged them, and they asked him to leave. Paul left with his new followers and set up a church in the Hall of Tyrannus. He spoke there regularly for the next 2 years. Many locals and visitors heard him speak and were convinced of his message. One of those visitors was Philemon. During Philemon's stay, he went and listened to Paul. What Paul said made sense, and he believed, and he was baptized. He left Ephesus a Christian and travelled back to Colossae. In the first century, often when the head of the household became a Christian, his whole family and his slaves were baptized into this faith. No doubt this new religion was quite threatening to any member of the household who didn't either understand it or believe it, particularly a slave. No one knows what Onesimus' tipping point was, but it was enough to drive him towards the unthinkable. He grabbed some of Philemon's possessions and ran away. He would now spend the rest of his life on the run. Running away from your owner was deadly serious in the Roman world. Roman officials were particularly harsh on runaway slaves. Aside from the fact that a slave was the property of another person, much of Rome's economy was built on slave labour. The Romans could not afford to have slaves just up and leave their place of work. What would happen if everyone did it? This actually happened 130 years earlier, around 70 BC, when a slave by the name of Spartacus fled from his owner. He was joined by thousands of other slaves and led a slave uprising in the heart of Rome. He and his army of slaves tried to march their way back into their homelands. Rome launched her armies against the rebels. They eventually crushed them. To make an example of Spartacus and the rest of his slave army, the Romans crucified them one by one on the road back to Rome. Spartacus' uprising shook Roman society to its very core. They couldn't afford to have another slave uprising. Therefore, harsh penalties were enforced on runaway slaves. Punishment could be as severe as crucifixion, or having the symbol for fugitive branded on your forehead. Just where was Onesimus going to run away to? He certainly couldn't flee to his place of birth. That would be the first place the authorities would look for him. He could look for safety from the goddess of Asia Minor, Artemis. Her main temple was in Ephesus. The temple in Ephesus was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. The temple housed a giant statue of the goddess Artemis. Aside from housing the statue, the temple also was a sanctuary for criminals. According to a very ancient tradition, an archer fired an arrow out of the temple in Ephesus. It landed about 140 meters away, and this became like a protection perimeter for criminals. It was believed for hundreds of years that if a runaway slave, a petty criminal, or even a murderer stood within the sanctuary of that area, they couldn't be arrested, no matter what they had done. So, as you can imagine, a sort of shanty-style town developed within this perimeter. On 2 occasions, complaints were made by local authorities who couldn't arrest certain criminals. When the priests ignored the local officials, the complaints were elevated to the highest power in the land, Caesar himself. During both Caesar Augustus and Caesar Tiberius' reign, the ancient right was questioned. However, priests from the temple argued that this ancient right of protecting criminals existed long before Alexander the Great. On both occasions, Caesar decided to allow it to remain. The problem for any resident of this makeshift town was that eventually they had to leave the protection perimeter to get a job, food, or supplies from the city. This left the person vulnerable and exposed, and at risk of being arrested. For Onesimus, like any other runaway slave, he had to find a way to survive while constantly looking over his shoulder. Who would show him compassion? The sort that he needed to survive in this city.
Master, thou rememberest that which Epaphras told thee, how Philemon's slave Onesimus is in hiding in the city. He is out yonder, lurking on the terrace.
Perhaps he knoweth not to what house he is come.
I would go on to the
Paul was also in Ephesus. Unlike Onesimus, he was not free, but rather he was in chains under house arrest. His 2 years of speaking in Ephesus managed to get a reaction from people, but it wasn't always a positive one. He'd upset the local synagogue authorities, who wanted nothing more to do with him, but he also managed to upset the local business people. A silversmith in Ephesus named Demetrius made little statues of the goddess Artemis. He noticed that less and less visitors were buying his product and blamed Paul's teaching. He declared to his workmen, "Men, you know we receive good income from this business. Paul has led large numbers of people astray, telling them that man-made gods are no gods at all." He and his workers erupted onto the streets of Ephesus. They shouted, "Great is the goddess Artemis." They didn't believe this, you know. It was only for their own economic reasons they started shouting like this. So they then marched to the theatre. They were joined by thousands of others, and the chant went up again and again, "Great is the goddess Artemis." After a few hours, the crowd broke up. Even though the crowd had departed, their hatred of Paul hadn't. Onesimus at the time was desperate, lonely, hungry, and still on the run. He would, however, find compassion from, of all people, Paul.
Onesimus, what brings thee here?
I know not, except I hunger and am alone.
Was his newfound faith established on his need for food and shelter? Or was it a heartfelt conviction? Being a Christian in the first century wasn't a popular decision in the Roman Empire. For the next 200 years, Christians would be persecuted, imprisoned, and even sentenced to death. Onesimus' faith would be immediately tested, not through the fires of persecution, but rather truth itself. The young slave's secret was quickly out in the open. Paul realized that this news placed him in a very precarious and often difficult situation. If the authorities found out that Paul was harboring a runaway slave, Paul, who was already under house arrest, could be charged and face serious punishment. Paul certainly didn't endorse slavery. However, he couldn't ignore Roman law. Nor could he just tell Philemon to let his young slave walk away free, since years earlier Caesar Augustus had passed a law that prohibited the emancipation of any slave under the age of 30. Paul was not the only one during the first century forced to mediate between a runaway slave and his owner. Pliny the Younger, a Roman official, was forced into similar circumstances. He writes to Sabinianus, "Your slave has come to me, flung himself at my feet, and clung to me as if I were you. He begged my help with many tears, because he realized he did wrong. You are angry, I know, and I know too that your anger was deserved. But mercy wins most praise. I've given the man a severe scolding and warned him firmly that I'll never make such a request again." Paul didn't want Onesimus to escape his past and to run away from it. He must enable Onesimus to face up to his past and rise above it. So he informs Onesimus that he must return to his owner. The prospect of returning terrified Onesimus. In contrast to Pliny, Paul addresses the issue in 2 letters written at the same time. One written to Philemon and the church that meets in his home, and the second to the broader church at Colossae, Laodicea and Hierapolis.